My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host, and this is a weekly session that we do here on Twitter Spaces called Gather to Grow. And we usually cover a number of topics, different commodities, unpacking it, understanding it, how new farmers can get started. And tonight we're talking about asparagus. And guys, I must tell you, it was a struggle to try and get people to speak to me. A lot of growers and farmers and people working in the asparagus sector keep their cards very close to their chest. So I'm very happy to have Graham Osler here. He's the National Sales and Marketing Director at Denmark State. Graham, thank you so much for being here. Just a little bit about yourself to kick off the conversation tonight.
Thanks, Dawn. It's also nice to share. We've actually been involved in asparagus growing. Well, I suppose I come from a family farm. We started in 1992. I fulfill the role of marketing and sales. So it's effectively just linking the production part of the business through to the sales part. So a lot of what I do is sort of sit down with the farm and, fortunately in the past few years, we've had a couple of different farmers and suppliers supply us up to sort of 9 different suppliers and sort of then just take their information to say, right, this is what we got coming in. Take that to the retailers, sit down with them and say, right, can we look at programs? What are the price points that work? Is there scope for an export market? And sit down and do that. We've actually been on a really awesome journey, I'd say, over the last 3 years where we've been trying to develop new farmers, specifically in the emerging farmer space. And very sad to say that, unfortunately, we've literally just had to pull the plug on 2 of the farms, but it's been an awesome experience, basically trying to take people up. And I suppose my viewpoint is grow the industry rather, because I think more people can benefit from it as opposed to sort of trying to keep the information to yourself. So I'd love to be able to share with whatever we can today. So if there are any questions, please feel free, and whatever I can share and the knowledge that I do have, I'll most certainly try and share with everyone.
Thanks so much, Graham. And I have to agree with you there. I mean, I had spoken to a number of farmers growing asparagus, but what they do tell me is that it's a pretty competitive market, and knowledge sharing with so many other commodities isn't much of a thing with people who's growing asparagus. Maybe as a start, I think you have painted a bit of a picture in terms of what it looks like, but maybe you can give us an overview of the asparagus market in South Africa. How many growers are there? You just mentioned the fact that in new farmers to start up. I myself visited a farm in the Free State like 3 years ago where a similar project was up and running with Francois Kraus and the VKB group. Maybe you can just give us a bit of a perspective of the asparagus market for the farmers listening.
Dawn, I'm actually going to start with asparagus in South Africa, which maybe just gives you a bit of an overview. Asparagus was first brought into South Africa by the Dutch settlers in the 1920s. It was actually brought into our farming area. So I'm based in the Eastern Free State. We've got a couple of farms on the Lesotho border and close, either side of Vicksburg and Clocolan. And it was grown very successfully there. So a lot of your missionaries started growing it. They brought it over primarily from the Netherlands. South Africa used to, in the 1960s, have a booming export market. Everything was white, and sort of in this Pacific Valley, there were probably, like I mentioned earlier, about anywhere between 35 and 40 farmers, fairly small-scale farmers, and it would all be white asparagus. The season was very, very short then. It was probably only between 6 and 8, maybe 10 weeks. A lot of that production was picked and dealt with during export agencies and then obviously either flown or shipped over primarily through to Europe. And what actually happened then is asparagus being very, very labor intensive, I think a lot of farmers opted to move away from the very labor intensive market. Peru became a national or an international player in the global scene, so the demand for South African asparagus dropped off. And then in about the mid-1990s, you sort of had this phenomenon where the international demand changed from white asparagus through to green asparagus. And I think over that transition, South Africa lost most of its growers. So being a combination of moving from white to green, being a combination of the very labor-intensive crop that it was, it fell away. So currently at the moment, I'm aware of 2 commercial farms, ourselves and another farm, other side Bethlehem, that primarily supply most of the retail. But I have heard of a couple of other farms that have grown and that have started. The 2 VKB farms that you mentioned, so we actually engaged with them about 3 years ago and took them through the entire process of providing all the technical knowledge that we had built up over the years, and then obviously took all of the asparagus and found a market for it. it worked really, really successfully. In the first year, we managed to basically move the entire volume into the South African market without really dropping the price, and just sort of through clever marketing and engaging with the retailers, managed to move everything. There was a small component that was exported, which was very great, but that is effectively the South African climate at the moment. So it's actually in a bit of a worrying place, because unless there are new farmers that are going to come in, my worry is that a lot of the information and knowledge that we do have of the South African growing climate might actually fall away. I know the one commercial farmer is actually phasing out, so there's most certainly room for new growers to come into the space.
This was by far one of the most difficult commodities to find people to speak to me about. And that was kind of scary for me as well, because my experience to date is always that you kind of give someone a step up. You hold your hand out so that you can pull new farmers and new ideas and new innovation into the sector. But for the first time, I've experienced the complete opposite when it comes to asparagus. But let's talk more, for the sake of knowledge sharing. Let's talk more about what farmers should understand when it comes to the climate conditions for growing asparagus. What is the ideal climate? Where is this crop grown predominantly in South Africa? We both mentioned the Free State and where you're based as well. But what is the ideal for farmers looking to venture into growing asparagus?
Asparagus is actually a desert plant. It really likes a very well-drained soil. If you look on the international growing locations, got basically Peru and Mexico that are currently the two biggest international growers. Their growing locations are on the west coast of those countries, where they've got cold currents coming in. So effectively, you want a mild summer climate. So here in the Eastern Free State, our summers generally on average will average out at about 28 degrees, and you don't want your night temperatures to drop lower than 15, 14 degrees. So that is ideally how the optimal growing location. If you can grow it in a desert environment, you can then start manipulating the plant with water. So I know growing locations sort of in Namibia, there are a couple of growing locations with a German heritage there where they are growing white asparagus. That would be a very good growing location. So the mild summers and the not too cold night temperatures in summer is what you're actually looking for. And then a well-drained soil. And what we've realized in the past, I think to grow asparagus successfully in South Africa, you must have access to water and irrigation. You can't rely on dry land sort of cropping and be at the mercy of the rain, because if you do go through a drought season, it can actually cause severe damage to your production in the long term as well.
During my discussions with farmers or growers of asparagus, the one person I spoke to was Sybrand Potgieter, and he farms in Namibia, and he said that what farmers should also understand is that frost plays a big role. So if your crop is exposed to frost, it basically means that you're done for. Is this something that farmers should be aware of and also consider, Graham?
So absolutely. I mean, asparagus is a summer crop in South Africa. So where we based, normally from about the 20th of August, you'll see that the shoots start coming through the ground. So from beginning of September, we'll start harvesting, getting in decent volumes, and that'll go through up until the end of March, sort of mid-April. So here in the Eastern Free State, traditionally we'll get our first frost anywhere from the 10th of April through until about the 20th of April. And that, will signify the end of the asparagus season. So once that frost comes, you're then done. I think obviously looking to extend the season in South Africa, if you can find growing locations from your March to August window where you're not susceptible to frost, could be a good option as well to grow it outside of the traditional summer season.
Now let's talk about soil requirements and preparation. What should farmers know and understand when they would like to venture into farming with asparagus?
Okay, so I think the first and most important thing that people need to know is that it's a long-term investment. So how it actually works is you get a seed, you germinate that seed, and it actually forms what we call a crown. And that crown is your root system that you'll plant into the ground. A crown will constitute of between 8 and 12 asparagus shoots that it will shoot up. So you'll plant your crown into the ground. That crown will be in the ground for 12 to 15 years. Thereafter, that's the sort of natural life cycle of an asparagus plant. So it's not something that you'll, replant every year. And obviously, the important thing to remember is once you've planted asparagus, once you've gone through that life cycle, you can't go and plant new asparagus crowns in old asparagus lands. So the asparagus actually leaves an enzyme in the ground which inhibits planting or reinvesting in asparagus. So you need to then look for, what we would term virgin soil or virgin asparagus soil. So you can always use that old asparagus lands for other crops. Normal, any of your grain crops should be able to do fairly well. Oats, wheat, maize, that type of stuff, clean it up. But it is a long-term investment. And then obviously once it's in the ground, the normal preparation, I think just, well-drained soil, fertilization. And I think there it would probably be best to consult an expert in terms of what sort of requirements you need there. I won't be able to tell you in that amount of detail for soil prep, but a well-drained soil is what you need. So asparagus doesn't actually like being very wet. We often say it doesn't like wet feet. So when it rains, you want it to rain. It must get enough nutrients and water, but it mustn't sit in water. So even in the lands that we have, you can see where if there are corners of the lands that are waterlogged, the asparagus actually dies. It doesn't grow at all. So you keep wanting to try and create good furrows, good drainage out of your lands, and it needs water, but not too much.
Now, how often can one harvest? You just spoke about 15 years from when you plant from the seed or the roots, like you call the crows. How often does one then harvest during this time?
The traditional asparagus season is actually quite short. If you had to grow asparagus from scratch, the normal natural season would probably only be for green asparagus, about 10 weeks. What we do here and what asparagus growers do worldwide is they then manipulate the plant to try and extend the season. And you manipulate your farming cycle. So you'll close lands at different times in order to get out the correct production. So what I would normally do is I'll work from the market back and say, we know that comfortably the South African market can absorb, or we can sell, let's say 3.5 tons, 4 tons per week. We then work that back to say, right, what can the land produce? Can it produce that much? And if can we produce that sustainably over a period of 5 months? Some of that can't be done. So obviously what happens with us here, we go through a massive peak in production in October. So from September, it will slowly start increasing in production. In October, it will actually triple in production for a period of 2 weeks, and then it drops off very, very quickly. And thereafter, you then have to bring in new lands in order to keep harvesting, to keep supplying into the market. And then you basically close off different lands, grow it out again into a fern, cut down the fern, and then you can harvest it again.
Does having access to a large space or lots of land, is that vital if you're considering asparagus? Because like you said, it needs to be the new roots or seed should be planted in what you refer to as virgin soil. After how many years can you then go back? Is there a way to go back, or is that not an option at all?
If you leave the land fallow and you can grow other crops on it for a period of, normally what we say is normally 10 to 15 years again, and then you go back onto it and you keep rotating. That's the experience that we've had in the South African growing locations. I'm not entirely too sure about the international space and how they work, but I know for us, that's the tried and tested method that we've learned over the years.
Is there then a way to grow it hydroponically or other options besides growing it traditionally in the soil like you've done?
Yes. So there is actually a development in South Africa where Chinese have invested in growing it under tunnels, which I think is a great concept. It's a different concept using different rootstock, sort of taller asparagus spears planted very close together to try and obviously minimize the labor expense. So there's not as much walking to basically harvest the asparagus. But then you obviously have the added expense of keeping the tunnels both warm and cold, and your irrigation expenses are the same. So yes, most certainly, I've seen it. I visited that site. It looks very interesting. I don't know too much about it. What I can see from the expenses of running it, it does seem to be more expensive than what your normal dryland cropping would be. Definitely something that I think is worth looking into for growers that are considering possibly going into asparagus as a return on investment option.
Now let's talk about the market. You mentioned that there are 2 commercial growers. I've seen people growing it in their home gardens just to eat and consume in that way. But what does it look like for a new farmer looking to expand or wanting to step into the sector? What can they expect? Who are they competing with?
Like I mentioned at the moment, locally in South Africa, I think there's a big opportunity for commercial farmers to establish themselves. We can see that the transition of farmers not reinvesting in asparagus, or current farmers not reinvesting in asparagus, means that there will most certainly be gaps in the market. It's so difficult to answer that question because I think as an emerging farmer, it depends on obviously how much land you have and your access to capital. I think the market, from the top of my head, I'd say at a rough estimate, if at a right price, the market should be able to absorb, the entire South African market will probably be able to absorb between 50 and 60 tons of asparagus per month. And that would be locally produced, selling at a fairly competitive rate on shelf. What actually happens is that because no one in South Africa has managed to competitively grow asparagus in our winter months, we're forced to import. So, we've been importing in, like I mentioned, from Peru and Mexico for the last 12 years. And your biggest expense there is your freight costs. So even though the cost to grow asparagus in Peru and Mexico is not vastly cheaper than what we grow it in South Africa, it is cheaper, I think, because of their economies of scale and the efficiencies. But the cost to get it over to South Africa, everything has to be air freighted and imported. And unfortunately, there's no direct flight, whether you're flying from Lima or from Mexico City. It's got to go either via Los Angeles or via Europe or via Argentina. That cost adds huge expense to it. So the product effectively then triples from your local cost on shelf to your imported cost on shelf. And obviously with that vastly tripling of your price, your demand effectively also drops by about 2/3. So what I'm saying is that the South African market, in terms of consumption, should be able to consume between 50 and 60 tons if grown at the correct price in the local season. And there's definitely space, I think, for farmers to come in. I think for an emerging farmer, you need to do your sums and say, well, how much land do I have available and how much capital do I have to grow this? And what is sustainable to get my return on investment and my feasibility study? And I think doing that sum correctly is important.
Maybe you can just break down some of the cost involved, Graham, for a new farmer now considering this. Okay, they're thinking about it. They've now listened to what you had to say. They think, okay, maybe this is viable. Maybe I should look into it. What should they be budgeting for? What should they be thinking about in terms of input cost? You did mention that it's quite labor intensive. Are there ways of working around that? I do think that this is such a huge sector to create jobs. So why isn't it that we're pushing for this? What would you say in terms of that as well?
So Dawn, I won't know enough about the specifics of your input costs. So what I do know is your seed cost is very expensive. You've obviously got to import that in. Most of the seed that is planted in South Africa has come out of the US, University of California. But I would say to any growers, do your homework there because I think there are new genetics in the world. At the moment, most certainly, I think there's a good space for new farmers to come into the market. I think there are gaps opening up. I think in order to do that, I'd do your homework very carefully. I think relook at it in terms of the latest variety and genetics that's available. A lot of your genetics is coming out of the Netherlands at the moment, and it is a little bit tricky because you're having a Northern Hemisphere geneticist that's busy producing genetics for the Southern Hemisphere and very vastly different growing locations. I think also visiting sort of countries like Peru and Mexico and seeing countries in a very similar latitude, longitude, and climate. What varieties are they using? Are there any new techniques? I know, from when we planted sort of 12 years ago, a lot has changed. You're planting the plants a lot closer together. The rows are a lot narrower. I think just to try and do all those cost savings in terms of labor. So one of your questions were, what are the big components? So labor is probably one of your biggest expenses. And obviously in South Africa, we've had fairly rapid increases in labor wage, and that is a big expense. Your establishment costs are a big expense. So all your rootstock, your seeds will have to be imported. They are very expensive, but I can't tell you specifics. I honestly don't know. I haven't been close enough to that lately to tell you what that is. And then I would definitely invest in irrigation. I think from there, your next expenses are your market access. You've got to have the correct packing facilities. Cold chain is vitally important with asparagus because it is such an expensive product. You've got to have refrigeration, storage, and trucking and transport. And then access to market. I think engaging in, whether you decide to go into the open market, engage in with the catering trade or the modern retail trade, I think trying to secure those growing programs is also important, that at least what you are picking, you've at least got a market for. So asparagus is also, unfortunately, one of those crops. Once you pick it, you can't sit on the crop for very long. You've got to basically move it immediately into the market and try and get it sold.
Is there a demand in South Africa? I think you spoke earlier about we can consume about 50 tons. Is that per month? Are people looking for it? I was teasing to say that after all this effort that I'm making with this space and getting experts to talk to me, I'm definitely going to go buy some asparagus and eat it and, enjoy it. Do South Africans enjoy the asparagus? Are they sort of people missioning to, create recipes? What does it look like in terms of that?
Just speaking from my experience with the South African retail market, there is most certainly an interest. I think asparagus holds a fairly high regard in terms of being a vegetable because it's got so many health benefits or perceived health benefits. Most of the retailers are looking to invest in growing the category. Unfortunately, it is very expensive. So if you had to go and buy off the shelf now, you're probably going to pay anywhere between sort of 55 to 60 Rand for a 200 gram bundle. It is ridiculously expensive. You work it out a Rand per kg, what you're paying there, it's quite frightening. Whereas if you had to buy the same size in the local season, you would probably pay anywhere from 24 Rand to 29 Rand off shelf. And I think that is the indication in terms of the difference between local asparagus and imported asparagus and your massive price fluctuations. To grow it locally, there is a massive market for it because we know that the market can comfortably consume between 50 and 60 tons per month in the local season. And I'd love you to go and buy some and try it. I think to answer your question, definitely there's a worldwide interest in asparagus. We can see that the category is growing. Our figures over the last 10 years would give us that if we had enough asparagus, we would comfortably grow the category, I'd say, between 6 and 12% year-on-year volume growth. If we had more, and if we had more local asparagus in our winter months, I think we would see even bigger growth figures coming out of it.
Okay, Graham, you've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much for carrying this space. I usually have a few more experts, but you've really given us a lot to think about. And really, as a first, I'm really excited about this crop. And I do think that farmers should consider it. And I think that it's really important that we're having this conversation. So thank you so much. Just as a question in terms of farmers who might be growing a specific crop, but they want to diversify. Is it possible to do it on a specific amount of land? And, is that viable for them? Or should they rather go, large scale and go full into it? And what should they be thinking about?
If there are any aspiring growers that are serious about growing asparagus, they are welcome to get in touch with me. As a company, we would love to sort of offer technical knowledge and market access. We've built up a really great market. I'd hate to see the South African market fall away because we don't have enough growers. I think it's about doing a feasibility study on a case-on-case basis. What land is available? How much land is available? And does it actually make sense? It's because it's one of these crops that is a fairly medium to long-term investment. You've got to really do a feasibility study to say, right, if I've got 5 hectares, will I make money? If I've got 50 hectares, will I make money on that? And I think I won't be able to answer that offhand. We'd have to sort of engage on a feasibility and sort of say, right, this is what the return back to farm is. These are the expenses. This is how we would like to do it. And, that's effectively how we ran with the VKB farms as well. Provided a lot of technical knowledge that we had. But I do think there is so much more knowledge out there that more than what we have that is worth also trying to get hold of. If anyone would be interested, they're obviously welcome to contact myself to sort of have a look at an option of engaging and part with Denmark to try and help grow asparagus.
Thank you so much, Graham. And then maybe just final tips or advice for farmers just in terms of growing the crop and then, what should be top of mind when it comes to farming with asparagus.
Do your research. Don't only look locally, look internationally. I think the international growing space is far more advanced than what it is locally. And then I'd say do a feasibility study. And my suggestion there is always advice that I give anyone is work from the market back. Secure your market and know that what you're going to be growing, you can sell. Instead of planting and hoping you can sell because you might come in at the wrong time with the wrong volume and then all of a sudden that entire investment doesn't pan out as you would have envisaged. So I'd say just do your homework. Look internationally to see what the international trends are in terms of genetics and different growing ideas to bring back into South Africa as well.
Thank you so much, Graham. Asle is the National Sales and Marketing Director at Denmark Estates. It was really great chatting to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me and for sharing this knowledge. I really want to champion this sector or this specific commodity so that we don't lose, our growers in South Africa. So thank you once again, and thank you to everyone who's listening. We will be having another session next week, same time, same place. Thank you so much for joining me on Gather to Grow once again. My name is Dawn, and have a lovely evening further. Bye.